So I've never necessarily said I was a huge fan of the American Horror Story franchise. I watched the very first season when it first premiered, and I have to say I wasn't necessarily into the show. Maybe a little bit of 20 minutes into the first episode when we realized the maid was both young and old at the same time. That made me feel like, oh my god, what the hell is happening? And the same thing can probably be said about Asylum. I wasn't necessarily into it at the very beginning, but if I'm really thinking about it and if I'm very honest with myself, I felt like that was one of the best seasons of television that I've ever seen in my life. It just came together, in my opinion, and although I feel like, yes, it was a little overstuffed, it definitely almost everything worked, and I can't necessarily wait to rewatch that. I did give up around Coven, and I haven't really watched it since. Part of that was because I felt like Coven was a diversion, or at least a huge step down from what Asylum was, but at the same time, I didn't necessarily enjoy the way that they were pushing the show forward. They didn't necessarily think out the third season. Now, I have since picked up the entirety of the series back up, and while I haven't watched every season thus far, I will eventually, and I've been trying to catch up and watch Cult as it kind of airs every single week, and that's why I do these videos. Basically, part of that is because Ryan Murphy said that this was going to be directly related to the real world life and fears, and not necessarily vampires and zombies and aliens and witches and ghosts, everything that we've come to expect from American Horror Story. It was going to be set in the real world, and it was going to be dealing with the 2016 election, which was a very volatile time in our entire lives. I'm sure no matter who you are, no matter what your political philosophy or anything like that, it was an entirely difficult time. So one of the things I've really liked about this is that it does feel incredibly relatable. One of the things I really disliked about catching up with the American Horror Story franchise is the very fact that so many of the jokes and so many of the scares and everything, at least for me, fall flat. And while I said in my last video about this that I don't necessarily get scared, I'm not a really good gauge about everything that's going on, whether this is supposed to be really freaking you out or whether this is supposed to be grossing you out, I don't necessarily get into that mindset. What I do understand, though, is characters and situations that are playing off of each other to actually create a story. And while the last couple seasons that I have watched of this show have been a little bit weird and a little less thought out, this one, as wacky as it is, definitely seems to be playing out in a really interesting way. I personally don't necessarily know what's going on right now, and I feel like they're baiting me in that sense because I don't know whether I'm supposed to be thinking of maybe something supernatural is going on here, considering the time and history that I've spent with this show, or that most fans have spent with the show. We're so used to seeing supernatural aspects come up that maybe something like that is playing in the world right here, considering the fact that they brought in Twisty, which kind of indicates that yes, that the whole freak show concept probably did take place, and he's just kind of an icon who now has his own comic book series from the first episode. Who really knows? But I really like the idea that they're not necessarily jumping overboard and giving us way too much that we can't handle. The mere fact that people are actually afraid of clowns and afraid of actually being in coffins, as we see in this particular episode, is fear enough for most people to keep us up at night, and I really do appreciate that. One of the things I really do like about this particular season, though, is the very fact that it's playing off of a comedic standpoint that I personally can relate to. Although I do sit here and I cover movies and television shows and anime from time to time, I don't necessarily keep up and I don't necessarily understand or even appreciate all the pop culture references that I've seen throughout the entirety of this series thus far. And I feel like most of those jokes, at least for me, really fall flat. But when you're talking about liberalism, conservatism, like the idea that oh, you're racist, or you're misogynistic, or you're doing this or that or the other, I understand that because not only do I participate in that conversation, not in a really volatile way, but I do understand that culture, and I understand when something is actually supposed to be funny and when it's not. I honestly really appreciate that, and if this is what they've been going for, and this is the corny type of writing that they've been trying to hit over the last couple seasons, although it doesn't work for me, I'm sure it works for a lot of people, and if it works as well for them as it does this season does for me, I completely understand that. This episode dealt with the neighbors of Allie and Ivy and how freaking crazy they are. So one of the things that I really like about that particular aspect is it really does help play off the aspect I was talking about last week and kind of got us back on track, at least to where I think this season is going. Although, as I said before, I think Sarah Paulson's character Allison definitely kind of feels like she is a progressive and she can talk with minorities and she sympathizes and all this other stuff. And at the same time, the neighbors across the street probably see themselves as that as well, considering the fact that it's a older woman who married her gay friend from high school, considering the fact that they weren't necessarily married by the time they're 40. I understand that they consider themselves this, but at the same time, they're just as ignorant and messed up as all the other people in Evan Peters' camp who are incredibly conservative and trying to basically break down the system. One thing that this season I think is trying to tell us is the very fact that even though you consider yourself this way or that way, when it all comes down to fear and uncertainty about the future, we all basically break down to our basic nature and we try to lash out at the things that we don't understand. I personally really appreciate that aspect of this show, and I really hope that they continue it further. On the other hand, I really want to talk about the mystery of this particular season and where, in fact, they're leading it, because although I've never necessarily felt like any of the American Horror Story seasons that I've seen kind of start off with who done it, I honestly feel like this one is actually playing in that direction. We have Winter who, why haven't they fired Winter yet? This is just, this makes me mad in terms of what I'm watching. It's just so unrealistic. After everything and all the mistakes that she has made through this entirety of the first 3 episodes of this freaking show, they should fire Winter. She's a terrible, terrible nanny. Anyway, with everything that's going on, I don't necessarily know who to trust and who not to trust. One of the things is Allison's therapist seems like he's involved with this, considering the opening of this show, kind of talking with the woman who's afraid of being buried alive, basically put in a coffin, and maybe he has something to do with it, especially that conversation he has with Allison during the particular situation where she goes to talk with the protesters. He seems incredibly disinterested when people aren't in the room, and potentially he's the one feeding the information to Evan Peters' character in order to actually get the clowns on her and to make sure that they are just as scared. Kind of using people's own fears against them and playing the system in that way. Of course, we all have our thoughts and opinions on who exactly is doing this, and I'm not necessarily sure whether or not it's going to play out as a whodunit or who's actually in control of this murderous cult of clowns, but it is going to be really interesting over the next couple of weeks to watch every single week and decide or figure out all of the intricacies that's going on here. I've said it before and I will say it again. American Horror Story usually has that really awesome moment where all these kind of loose plot threads really kind of start tying together, and it's a big aha moment. And after a couple of weeks of watching this, especially whether you're binging it or week to week, it really is satisfying, and I'm really hoping to get something like that in this season, because at this point I really feel like this is going to be one of their stronger seasons since that of Coven or Freak Show. I know a lot of people like Freak Show, a lot of people like Coven. It's really split. So I feel like this is going to be one of their stronger seasons in the last couple of years, and hopefully that quality continues to the later seasons of the show, considering the fact that they're going to do a crossover season of Coven and the Murder House in the next season. So guys, tell me what you think about the episode in the comment section below. I really want to know. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell over by the subscriber button to notify you every single time I upload. But with that being said, guys, I hope everyone has a good day. It's been real.